Hello, everybody. I'm Derek Arden, and welcome to Monday Night Live and Uncut podcast, the 223 edition. I'm delighted to welcome Amy Rowlinson today, who's a good friend of Monday Night Live. In fact, Amy joined the very first one on the 23rd of March 2020. That was quite a significant day for you as well, Amy, wasn't it? Because I think that's when you launched your podcast. How about that for synchronicity, etc.? Amy, welcome and thanks for joining us. And will you tell us a little bit about the first 25 years or 28 years of Amy Rowlinson's life?
Yeah, well, the first half of my life, we're talking football. This is the first half, and then we can go into the second half. So I grew up in Stratford-upon-Avon, and I had two huge influences in my life. There was Shakespeare, and there was my grandfather. And I often spent many a time going to one of the many theatres in Stratford. I also rowed on the river right in front of the theatre. I became a national rowing champion in 1990. I then went on to read linguistics at university at Reading. And then I ended up in the City of London working, and more specifically in Grosvenor Street, working for a recruitment company. And I ended up being a manager of the temps division there with around 400 temps working every week. And then I went on a career break to have my two children. So that's the first half, Derek.
Now, didn't you win an award for Bromley Town Cricket Club and go to Lord's and be awarded it by the English Cricket Board?
What, this one? Yes, I did.
Yeah.
So I went to Lord's, invited there to receive an award, although I didn't know at the time that I was going to be a winner when I was invited. So there were a room full of lots of people who have been doing extraordinary things for cricket all over the country, and mine was for the Outstanding Service to Cricket Award, was for bringing together the community in a huge volunteer project, kind of like a combo of changing rooms and ground force. It was fantastic. And Michael Vaughan gave me the award, and there were lots of exciting people there from past and present cricket. So there was Johnny Bairstow was sat right behind me, and Mike Gatting was on another table. Yeah, it was fantastic. But at that event, I got headhunted to go and work for a project management company. It was a startup business funded by Dragon's Den James Caan. And would you believe it? It was in the office opposite my old office in Grosvenor Street. So, literally 12 years after leaving, I find myself back in the same street in the City of London, well, in the West End of London, working for a project management company doing the marketing, branding, and relaunched it. And on the day after I relaunched it, I decided to step away and set up my own business. And that was in 2016. To enable my husband to leave his job, I built a business which would allow him to be more free in his daily activities, and he's taken over running of that. And I, meanwhile, set up another training business in property investment. I held monthly networking meetings. I launched my first podcast. And then, as you rightly said earlier, COVID hit. And on that day, the 23rd of March, 2020, we all know it first very well. It was the first day of lockdown in the UK. And I thought we would be taking everything online. But my business partner had other plans, and he said he didn't want to continue with the business at all. And I was pretty much devastated because I really enjoyed what I was doing. But then when I looked at it, I didn't necessarily enjoy the property side of things, but I love the networking, I love the podcasting. So I then had an idea for Focus on Why. I woke up with that idea on the 1st of April, and under 30 days, I had it launched by the 30th of April. And here we are now, 407 episodes down the line from there.
Oh, brilliant. Well, congratulations on that. So you must have had some very interesting people on your podcast. What are your takeaways from the 407 editions?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because everybody's got very different perspectives, very different reasons for why they're doing what they're doing. And despite all these differing perspectives and unique reasons for their purpose and their why, there are some common traits between all of them, and that is that they are living versus existing. And the difference that I make between that is that they're very conscious about what it is that they want to achieve in life, and they're not just sort of sleepwalking and drifting, as I found myself guilty of doing at some point in the more recent years before I discovered just how purposeful I could be with what I wanted to do. So that's one thing, the living versus not existing. And then the other thing is that people who come on the podcast, they are very consciously creating their why and living it, as opposed to finding it. Or you often hear that, oh, how do I find my purpose? How do I find my why? And you don't. It is absolutely something that is a conscious creation, and it evolves. And this is the other thing, is that it evolves as you evolve. Your sense of purpose changes and moves, and as you constantly challenge your status quo and question it, so does your purpose evolve with it.
Was that number 2 or was that number 3 as well?
That was 3. Yeah.
That was 3.
So living, not existing, and then there is the not finding but creating, and then it's a constant questioning and evolving. Those are the
Brilliant.
3 elements. Yeah.
So did Simon Sinek have any influence on you there?
He did. And it was his whole start with why that I realized, well, actually, it's all very well starting with, but actually you need to focus on. So it's not enough just to start with and get going. It's that constant focusing on evolution element that's really critical here, and taking responsibility for all your actions while focusing on your why, because that's how you bring your vision into reality.
Sure. Now, tell us all about this you had 2 grandfathers, didn't you? You told me, but
I did, yeah.
and you had different relationships with both of them. Tell us a little bit about both of them quickly.
Oh, well, yes. So I need to be really clear that this book that I have written, I am not a war historian, and it is very clear that there are 2 huge influences from both my grandparents. One was very much a soldier who wanted to be a soldier, and the other was not. So how you discern the difference between that is that one couldn't stop himself from wanting to be on the front line, and the other one was really not keen to be on the front line at all. And I'm actually writing about the one who was not keen to be on the front line, because he signed up through conscription. He believed very much in peace, and whereas my other grandfather, also a very peaceful man, but had chosen a career in the army, and he actually was a really incredible soldier. He was a major general in the Desert Rats, and he fought alongside Montgomery and had communication in person with Churchill. He was incredible, but that's not the story I'm telling in my book. And I've always wanted to write a book since I was about 8. It's been my dream to do that, and I wanted to write a book about purpose also. I didn't want to write just another shelf development book. I wanted it to be something unusual, but on the topic of purpose, and using all this incredible wisdom, knowledge, insights, everything that's come from the podcast in that as well, alongside my own thoughts and perspectives on this topic. So I actually thought, well, how do I come about this? And I signed up with a publisher to have a one-on-one creative writing session to help me to distill my ideas. And she helped me to come to this idea that I could actually write a book about my grandfather using his wartime stories that I have as a huge cherished childhood memory. And these would contain hidden life lessons that would help a reader navigate the future, and I could use some of the stories linked in as well from my podcast guests. So I had this idea, and then I started calling it the book. No pressure there. And that's probably what led to writer's block, because my grandfather, who I am writing about, who told these wartime stories about being a prisoner of war more so, he was a brilliant playwright. He was a writer for TV, radio, stage. He had an incredible way with words. And so I suffered with imposter phenomenon, not knowing how I could possibly write stories from his perspective. And so I actually asked a coach to help me get over this limiting belief that I couldn't write his stories. Now, he wasn't even alive. He died in 1996. So I feel judged writing these stories by someone who's not even alive at all. And so in this session I had with a coach, it's a bit bizarre. Now, I'm really aware that I'm voicing a dialogue between myself and my grandfather, but we had this conversation, and it is like a meditation, but a conversation. And I'm voicing both parts of what my grandfather's saying to me. And he essentially helped me to understand that what I'd been doing in podcasting was an extension of what he did in broadcasting, and that it was a slightly different medium, but I was doing very similar work to what he'd already been doing, and that my writing and in my blogs and also in my podcasts had been affecting people and helping them to understand how to live a more purposeful way of life. So he told me how proud he was, which he often did, and how wonderful the podcast was. So I felt very supported by him. And I'm not deluded. I know that it was me just giving myself a bit of a pep talk in this conversation, but it was really real for me. And so I then sort of resumed writing and unlocked my potential that I could write this book. Now we're in 2022, April, and I went to the PSA conference, the Professional Speaking Association conference in Wales, and I was on my way home from that when I got a very unexpected call. My grandmother had had a fall, and I had to make it straight home. Now, she was really fit and well, really confused how this had happened, but it was very clear that she wasn't going to make it. And unfortunately, I did have to say goodbye to her the next day. Now, my grandparents had been a huge influence on me, both of them, throughout my life. And I was going through some of my grandmother's things, and yeah, I found a box which had George, the name of my grandfather, on the side, and in brackets underneath, Precious. And in that box, I found an item, Derek. It was pretty exciting.
Have you got? Have you just? Coincidentally, have you just got it there, Amy?
I have. So this is it. So this is his commonplace scrapbook. It's, for me, probably the most valuable treasure I've ever found. Essentially, it's a diary that he kept for 5 years as a prisoner of war, and it's beautifully written inside. So here I am looking at this, and it falls open coincidentally to September the 30th, 1942. And this is what it said: proposal to write way of life, to meet the need for a planned life, to meet every circumstance of life, every facet of living. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I open up and close out my podcast with have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why. And here is my grandfather. He got there first. Right, he's already writing this, and I'm like, oh. So yes, I'm 80 years later speaking about a planned life, and yeah, typical that he would get there first. Of course he would, but it was incredible. And so I said to my mum, can I take this home? Because obviously I was in a bit of a state of grief, and it was all too much to start reading that. So I did take it home, and I was PSA president for the Southeast region in 2022. I had a lot on, and I actually put aside the writing of the book for a few months. So a few months did pass, and I wanted to still write a book, but I also had other ideas to write different books. I wanted to write like a modern day Aesop, stories from the podcast, lessons again. It was all tying together, but nothing was flowing. And so I pulled out the book again and sat and read it from cover to cover. And I have to say that I spent most of that time with tears rolling down my cheeks, because I now realised that I had that missing piece of the jigsaw. Almost a year after I'd had the idea for this book of writing wartime stories, between him telling them to me and then realizing that I've actually got them, and it's his words that I can use. So yeah, it was pretty special, really pretty special.
Did his fear and emotions come over in his writing?
Yeah, it's really vulnerable, and I think that's what's so beautiful. And I do write about this in the book as well, that I have included lots of things that probably he might not have wanted me to share, and I've had to take quite a lot of guidance from. I've spoken to my mum about what I have included, but there's something that gives me permission, and it's on the 25th of March in 1945 that he writes this, and it's from this piece that I feel I can include what he's written in this book, because he says, doubtless it too would contribute something to history, but a later chronicler must speak of this. So absolutely, he's documented all of his experience, his thoughts, his doubts, his fears about signing up, about going to the front line, about evading capture and then being caught and being marched across the country from France into Germany to then live in 4 different prisoner of war camps for 5 years. And he has documented all of it. And so, yeah, no one else is going to read this. So that later chronicler has to be me.
Well, congratulations on doing it. How did he keep the book and keep it in the concentration camp and escape with it? Well, he didn't escape, did he? He was let out, presumably.
Yeah, so it's a prisoner of war camp and it's an officers camp. It's a very different environment to a concentration camp. The environment for officers was better. It wasn't great, but it was better. And there were still random shootings. There were random marches at any time of the day. They became pretty low in the order for food as well as the war continued. And he does write about that, about how a lot of the food that was sent specifically for them didn't actually ever make it. So he does talk about how he was hungry a lot of the time. So yes, he was allowed to keep it, as he was allowed to have letters and receive letters. Often they were censored. And I've also got a lot of the letters that he sent and received, as well as photographs. And so together I have put together pieces from all of these different moments to sit alongside this framework that I've put together about creating a purposeful way of life.
Wow, that's fantastic. It really is. We're nearly at the end of the interview, the podcast. Have you got anything to tell us that we've missed?
Yeah. So I thought there might be a few things, and I went up into my grandmother's loft and looked for some more things. I knew that there was a manuscript that he'd written about a prisoner of war camp. It was called A Month of Sundays, and I also reached out to the BBC archives to see if they could find it. I went up into the loft. I found quite a few other things, of which I found this. It was a little envelope, and in that envelope was a tiny cassette. Now, on this cassette is an interview of me, aged 15, interviewing him about being a prisoner of war. So again, not only have I got his book, his words, I've now got a tape, his actual voice explaining what it felt like and what it was.
Gee.
I got the BBC archives found his script and they sent it to me. But I'd written a blog about finding this tape and I put it on the internet, and I got an email from a PhD student in Australia saying that he was studying my grandfather because he was one of the key figures in the late 1950s and early 60s in his area of work in television. And here I am, literally writing about my grandfather on this side of the planet, and so is someone else across. And he said, would you like all of his manuscripts that I've got? And yes, I would. And then I also got an email from his nephew and said, oh, I've got a article that George wrote about the play that he'd written. Would you like that? So yes, I've got a newspaper clipping. So the universe has definitely conspired to pull together all these sort of serendipitous findings, but also synchronous. Synchronicity is at play here. And that's a term that Carl Jung coined in terms of meaningful coincidences that seem to defy logical explanation, hinting at this deeper interconnectedness between events and inner lives. And I'm thinking, well, what is it about all of these coincidences? Like, how is this happening? And then I remember that on the 10th of November, 1993, my grandfather wrote to me while I was at university, and he wrote this. We tend to react at the astonishing fact of a coincidence, but surely what would be really remarkable would be if, considering the millions and millions of possible combinations of events, if there were never any such coincidences. So he told me to look another way. So yes, I have written the book. It's called Focus on Why, your uplifting guide to creating a purposeful way of life. So I've managed to get his way of life in there. So I have fulfilled the proposal that he had on the 30th of September 1942. I have also become that later chronicler who must speak of this in writing this book.
Well, that's staggering. Congratulations. Well done. Last question. Did he write about, or did he tell you about post-traumatic stress syndrome?
Not in so many ways. He did talk about how it affected him, and there was an incident that happened right at the end. They were being marched out of the camp, and they actually became victims of strafing. So Allied bombers were coming over, the Americans were coming over to liberate a lot of the prisoners of war, and they mistook his march for German soldiers, and so they all had to dive in the ditches. So literally, after surviving 5 years of prisoner of war camp, he was almost killed. Unfortunately, several of his friends were,
Oh,
and then there's another element, which was he's waiting on the tarmac to be repatriated on VE Day, and the flight that takes off before his crashes and kills everyone on board. So, I mean, there are so many events where he has been spared and he makes it home with his book, and for me to tell the story. And many of you will have watched a huge amount of the events that have just happened with the anniversary of D-Day, and this I actually shared on LinkedIn what he wrote about those landings and how he felt and how helpless he felt, knowing that there was nothing he can do, and he was just, he still had to wait a long time before he got liberated. It was over a year afterwards, or just under a year afterwards, from that date to the 1945 when he finally was able to come home.
mm.
So yes, he did talk about that, but not in the way that we would know it now, and certainly not in the way that he he used his plays, he used his writing. One of his plays speaks of survivor's guilt, and it's an Australian who is killed. He works with the French resistance, and another person goes back to see the plaque, and it turned into it. He wrote it originally as a French radio play, and then it was broadcasted as an Australian TV play, and it's called She'll Be Right. And yes, he talks about survivor's guilt in that. So I think he probably used a lot of what he felt and voiced it through the characters in the best way he could.
Brilliant, Amy. A couple of comments in the chat box. Every time I hear this, I get goosebumps from me as well. Great story, Amy. Well done, the later chronicler. Amy, thanks for coming on Monday Night Live. Thanks for being a great supporter of Monday Night Live over the 4 years I've been running this. And will you come back again when the book is launched and share some of those stories that are within the book?
Oh, absolutely love to. Yes, and I really can't wait actually to share this, because I've shared it with a handful of people. So I think 3 or 4 people have actually read it, and Charlotte, who's on this call now, is one of them. And yeah, she has had a lot to say on what this book is going to do. So it feels really vulnerable, but I will absolutely come back and talk about the book when it's launched in October. So thank you, Derek.
Well, brilliant. And we'll try and get Damian Lewis on, who's also the great World War II chronicler, who you and I both know and is a big supporter of Monday Night Live and our top masterclass. Amy Rowlinson, thanks for joining us on Monday Night Live. And will you stay on for a few personal questions?
Absolutely. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you.